You fill in some bubbles about who lives in your house, you mail the form back to the government, and you probably completely forget about it. I mean, for most of us, filling out a census form just feels like, well, the ultimate mundane chore. Just a bit of required paperwork.
Yeah, it's just administrative overhead, right? People see a demographic statistic in a news article and, they rarely think about the vast machinery required to generate that single number.
Exactly. But stepping into the world behind that piece of paper reveals this wild landscape of ancient empires, fierce political rebellions, and honestly mathematical models that are incredibly complex.
Right, which is exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. We're pulling back the curtain on the census.
Yeah, we're relying on a really comprehensive Wikipedia article today, tracking the history, the methodology, and the increasingly automated future of counting humanity.
Exactly.
So our mission is to unpack the ancient origins, the intense political battles, and the statistical methodologies hiding behind population data, just so you can view those numbers with a completely new perspective.
And to understand modern demographic data, we really need to look at why governments started taking on this massive logistical burden in the first place. Because, spoiler alert, early states didn't invent the census to figure out where to build a new hospital.
Right, or how to route a local bus line. In fact, the word census itself comes from the Latin word censor, which means to assess.
Yeah, and looking at the sources, early censuses functioned way less like a community survey and much more like, an IRS audit combined with a military draft notice.
Which sounds terrifying, honestly. I mean, in ancient Egypt, the earliest recorded censuses didn't even count human beings, right?
No, they didn't. They were strictly cattle counts. They conducted them every 2 years just to assess livestock for taxation. It was purely an inventory of wealth.
Wow. Just cattle.
Yeah, but eventually the state realized they needed to track the human labor force too. The historian Herodotus actually noted that Ahmose the first monarch of the New Kingdom, instituted a system where every Egyptian had to declare annually to a local official exactly how they earned their living.
Because the state needs to know how you make your money to tax it effectively. I mean, obviously.
Right. And when we look at the Roman Empire, the stakes attached to this kind of assessment get dramatically higher.
Oh, for sure. The sources mention that in the 6th century BC, King Servius Tullius counted 80,000 arms-bearing citizens. So they were using the count to rigidly assign citizens into classes for, tax obligations and military duties.
Yeah, the physical act of assessing wealth and manpower became this core mechanism for imperial control. And because it was basically an instrument of extraction, the census could be a highly volatile trigger for unrest.
Oh, right, the rebellion in 86.
Yes. So the Roman legate Publius Sulpicius Quirinius organized a census of Judea. The imperial administration, they just wanted to streamline tax collection.
Right.
But the local population viewed this forced registration as such a severe act of subjugation that it actually sparked the Zealot movement.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is. It directly laid the groundwork for several major rebellions against Rome.
So the administrative requirement to literally just put your name on a government list sparked a war. And, the logistical capacity required to maintain these lists across vast geographic areas is just staggering.
Oh, absolutely. Like in the year 82, the Han Dynasty in China conducted a census that modern scholars still consider remarkably accurate. They registered exactly 57,671,400 individuals.
Without computers. That is insane. But there's a huge caveat to that massive figure, right? Like, who exactly the Han administration was actually counting?
Right, yeah. They weren't undertaking this comprehensive demographic survey of every single soul in the empire. The focus was entirely on taxable families.
Because the imperial bureaucracy needed to calculate exact projections of agricultural income.
Exactly. And to determine precisely how many soldiers could be mobilized for military campaigns.
Okay, but if the Han Dynasty managed to track over 57 million people using, armies of scribes and physical ledgers, you have to wonder how an empire pulls off a census if they don't even have a written language.
Which is exactly the problem the Inca Empire faced in the 15th century, and they solved it with a completely different data storage system.
The copas, right?
Yes, the quipas.
Yeah.
So instead of ink and paper, their administrators recorded demographic and tax data using knotted strings of llama or alpaca hair.
That is so fascinating, just knotted hair.
Yeah, the system relied on a base 10 positional format. So by varying the types of knots, the spacing between them, and the colors of the cords, Incan census takers could store really complex numerical data sets.
So an entire regional administration's population records were essentially maintained on hanging textiles.
Basically, yes. But, moving from ancient empires to modern states, the core challenge shifts. It goes from simply extracting taxes to tracking a highly mobile, vastly larger population.
Right. And the United Nations attempts to standardize this massive undertaking by defining a census through three core principles, which are universality, simultaneity, and defined periodicity.
Meaning you need to count everyone, you need to count them all at the exact same moment in time, and you need to do it regularly, typically every 10 years.
But achieving simultaneity seems like the defining hurdle there. I mean, the concept requires taking a perfect snapshot of a nation on a single specific day.
Right, but modern populations do not stay static. They are constantly moving around. So to manage this, demographers differentiate between de facto residents and de jure residents.
Okay, break that down for us. What's the difference?
So de facto residence classifies you based on where you physically are on census day. De jure residence, on the other hand, classifies you based on your permanent legal address.
Oh, I see. So if a nation uses a de facto count, and I just happen to be on a 3-day business trip in Chicago on census day, I am counted as a Chicago resident, even if my mortgage and primary life are in New York.
Exactly, which introduces significant noise into local data. But, relying purely on de jure or permanent residence creates equal complications. Well, consider college students living in dormitories for 9 months of the year, or kids of separated parents who split their time evenly between two households.
Oh, or seasonal agricultural workers, right?
Exactly. Determining a single legal address for highly transient populations frequently leads to people being counted twice or entirely omitted.
So if the system is inherently vulnerable to overcounting students and missing migrant workers, modern statistical agencies must have mechanisms to correct those errors. I mean, you can't just publish the raw, flawed count.
You really can't. And the sources detail a method called dual system enumeration, or DSE. It's often compared to estimating the number of fish in a pond.
Oh, right. The sources actually mention an award-winning paper on this methodology titled Trout, Catfish, and Roach. I love that analogy.
It's a great analogy. The framework is known in ecology as the capture-recapture method. So if a biologist wants to know the fish population of a lake, they capture a sample, tag them, and release them. Yeah. Then later, they conduct a second capture. By analyzing the ratio of tagged to untagged fish in that second net, they can mathematically estimate the total population of the lake without having to drain it.
Right. So translating that to a human city, the initial census where everyone mails in their forms or fills them out online acts as the first capture.
Exactly.
But to execute the recapture, the agency would need to conduct an entirely independent, localized survey a few months later.
Yes, they send interviewers to specific blocks to see who actually lived there on census day, completely blind to the original responses.
Wow.
That secondary operation is called the post-enumeration survey. Once the agency has both sets of data, the matching process begins.
So statisticians compare the original census records against the new survey data.
Right. They categorize individuals into 3 groups: those caught in both nets, those caught only in the original census, and those caught only in the post-enumeration survey.
I see. So by analyzing the people who were only caught in the second survey, the agency calculates the exact percentage of people missed by the initial mail-in census.
Exactly. If the math shows they missed, say, 4% of young renters in urban centers during the first count, they apply a statistical weight to the final numbers.
Oh, so they adjust the overall population data upward to account for that specific missing demographic nationwide.
Yes. The modern census relies on the acknowledgement that a perfect count is a logistical impossibility. Agencies utilize these advanced probabilistic models to approach the true population value.
But wait, here's my question. If we know the count is never 100% accurate and relies on estimates, why do government entities present census data as hard absolute numbers?
Well, government entities rarely present the data with margin of error warnings because of how the data is legally used.
Right. We see a city population listed as exactly 2,463,012. The illusion of precision is maintained because the legal structures relying on the data require absolute numbers.
Exactly. You're apportioning elected representatives, drawing voting districts, and distributing federal funding. You simply cannot allocate a congressional seat based on a statistical probability bracket.
That makes a lot of sense. But generating incredibly granular data to satisfy those legal and funding requirements transforms the census into a potent target. I mean, the numbers dictate resource allocation and political visibility, so the data is immensely valuable.
It is, and simultaneously, the sheer specificity of modern demographic data creates severe privacy vulnerabilities.
The sources actually provide a really striking example of how aggregate numbers can easily compromise individual privacy.
Yeah, this is fascinating. So if an agency publishes the average income for various demographic segments within a small town, it appears to be harmless, generalized data, right?
Right, on the surface.
But if that town only has two black men aged 50 to 60, publishing the average income for that specific demographic bracket is actually incredibly dangerous.
Because if one of those two men knows his own income is $40,000 and the published average for his group in that town is $50,000, he can use basic algebra to deduce that the other man makes exactly $60,000.
Exactly. When researchers cross-reference multiple demographic variables in sparsely populated areas, seemingly anonymous aggregate data can very quickly be reverse engineered to expose private citizens.
Wow. So if releasing the raw data allows people to literally deduce their neighbors' exact salaries, the statistical agency must actively alter the information before making it public.
They do. They have to intentionally introduce errors into their own perfectly calculated data. The technique is in statistical disclosure control.
And how do they actually do that?
Well, agencies frequently use a method known as data swapping. So they identify households with similar demographic profiles in completely different geographic areas and just swap specific sensitive variables between them.
Oh, interesting. So they might take the $60,000 income of that 55-year-old man in one town and quietly swap it with the income of a 55-year-old man in a neighboring county.
Exactly. The macro-level statistics for the state remain perfectly accurate for researchers studying broader economic trends. But anyone trying to drill down into a specific neighborhood to expose an individual will hit a wall of scrambled data.
So to preserve the integrity of the individual's privacy, statistical agencies basically must inject a controlled layer of fiction into the local data.
Yes, they have to. Yet even with those rigorous disclosure controls, the fundamental requirement to hand over personal, racial, and economic data to a central authority makes the census a recurring target for political boycotts.
Right. Political historian Lawrence Cooley categorizes these protests by dividing them into boycotts regarding the census mechanics itself, and boycotts where the census serves merely as a highly visible symbolic target.
Yeah, and the 1911 UK census boycott led by the suffragettes is a prime example of that symbolic target. They protested with the slogan, "No vote, no census."
Which is pretty brilliant. The suffragettes leveraged the state's need for data to highlight their lack of civil rights. If the British government refused to recognize them as voting citizens, they systematically refused to be recognized in the state's demographic record.
Exactly. But beyond symbolic protests, many boycotts are deeply entangled with the actual categories printed on the form. A census confers visibility, right?
Because if your group is counted, your group officially exists in the eyes of the state's resource allocation matrix.
Exactly. In Kenya in 2009, several ethnic groups threatened to boycott the census unless the government provided them with distinct, specific categories on the form, rather than just grouping them under broader labels.
Right. But then the inverse scenario occurred in Myanmar in 2014. In that case, nationalist factions threatened widespread boycotts if the Rohingya population was allowed to self-identify on the census forms.
It's a really stark contrast.
It is. The tension surrounding these forms highlights a fascinating paradox for you to ponder. Marginalized groups often fight intensely to be included and categorized on a census for representation. But simultaneously, there is a legitimate historical fear of being counted, because placing specific ethnic or religious identifiers on a centralized government list creates a data set that the state could potentially abuse.
Yeah, the friction regarding government data collection spans all demographics. Even in Canada in 2010, Stephen Harper's government actually abolished the mandatory long-form census.
Right, and just to report this impartially based on the sources, the decision was rooted in the argument that compelling citizens, under threat of legal penalty, to provide highly personal details about their daily habits, housing conditions, and income was an overreach of state power.
Exactly. Now, while the Canadian long-form census was later reinstated in 2016 by Justin Trudeau's government, the episode really underscores the fragility of the social contract required to conduct a national survey.
You need the public's trust, and you need a massive logistical apparatus to physically distribute and collect the forms.
And in the early 2020s, that fragile combination was pushed to the absolute brink of collapse. The COVID-19 pandemic pretty much paralyzed the global statistical infrastructure.
Right, because according to the UN Statistics Division, the pandemic disrupted 77% of census operations globally.
Which makes sense. The foundational UN principle of a census, universal, simultaneous, physical enumeration, is fundamentally incompatible with a highly contagious airborne virus.
Yeah, a government cannot deploy hundreds of thousands of temporary workers to walk from door to door, conducting face-to-face interviews during lockdown.
They simply couldn't. And the operational delay cascades, leaving massive blind spots in global demographics. As of 2025, demographic giants like India and Nigeria, 2 of the 10 most populous nations on Earth, have still not been able to fully execute their delayed censuses.
And the prolonged absence of this data triggers what researchers refer to as a demographic data crisis. Without an updated, precise baseline, localized planning basically begins to fail.
Right. Think about it. If a city planner is trying to route a new water main or zone an area for a new elementary school in 2025, but they are relying on census data from 2011, they are essentially guessing.
Because the population might have doubled in that specific district due to recent urbanization, but the outdated municipal models won't reflect the new reality.
Exactly. Evidence-based poverty reduction strategies or emergency response frameworks depend entirely on knowing exactly where vulnerable populations are currently concentrated.
So because the traditional physical census proved so uniquely vulnerable to the pandemic, the sources show the United Nations is heavily advocating for a structural overhaul.
They are. They are pushing member states to adopt register-based censuses with the goal of making this the standard methodology by the 2030 census round.
And moving to a register-based system means eliminating the public questionnaires entirely, right?
Yes. Rather than asking citizens to fill out forms, the state executes a simulated census by integrating its existing administrative databases.
The Netherlands operates at the forefront of this methodology, according to the sources. They don't send enumerators into the field. Instead, they link tax records, employment databases, municipal population registers, and property databases.
Exactly. The statistical agency sets a specific reference date. On that day, the servers pull the data across all these disparate government registers, utilize matching algorithms to compile the information, and generate a comprehensive demographic profile of the nation entirely behind the scenes.
Which drastically reduces costs, limits the burden on the public, and is functionally immune to disruptions like pandemics. But I have a critical pushback here.
Sure, what is it?
Integrating disparate government databases must create severe data conflicts. I mean, if an algorithm is pulling my information, my tax return might list my permanent family address in Ohio, but my current employment payroll record lists my apartment in Seattle. If there is no human enumerator to clarify the discrepancy, the system needs a strict methodology to determine which database tells the truth.
It does, and resolving those contradictions requires complex hierarchical rules, often referred to as signs of life indicators.
Signs of life.
Yeah. The algorithms are programmed to weight certain registers over others based on recent activity. So if the tax register shows a permanent address, but a municipal utility database shows the individual actively paying for electricity and water at a different address, the algorithm will prioritize the utility data.
As the more accurate reflection of de facto residence.
Exactly.
Okay, the efficiency of an algorithm instantly parsing millions of tax and utility records is undeniable. However, doesn't transitioning to a completely hidden administrative census eliminate the civic engagement of the public actively contributing their data?
It's a huge shift.
It feels a bit like Big Brother silently tallying us up, rather than a community checking in on itself. Filling out a census form is a rare moment of direct civic engagement where a population actively participates in defining itself. If the process is reduced to servers silently cross-referencing our tax returns, we lose the civic ritual of the count.
And demographers note that this shift inherently alters the relationship between the state and the citizen. When an administrative census operates invisibly, citizens are no longer conscious of contributing their data.
Right.
Crucially, the ability for an individual to self-identify, to choose how they report their race, occupation, or household structure on a specific day is eliminated. The individual is strictly categorized according to the rigid definitions hard-coded into the government's administrative paperwork.
That is intense. You know, our exploration today of how humanity counts itself covers an immense spectrum. We looked at ancient Roman kings organizing populations for military service, and the Inca administration maintaining complex demographic ledgers entirely through knotted animal hair.
We examined the probabilistic fish counting models used to find the people missed by mail-in forms, and the deliberate statistical obfuscation required to protect our privacy in small towns.
And the trajectory of this logistical evolution points directly toward an increasingly automated future, where the monumental task of counting the population is handled silently by algorithms querying administrative registers.
So the illusion of a simple number really hides a continuous, complex effort to capture a fleeting snapshot of a moving population.
Exactly. The next time you see a demographic statistic, whether it's a population sign on the highway or a headline detailing the shifting age demographics of your state, remember the immense logistical machinery and the intentional statistical errors hiding behind that number.
It's never just a simple tally.
It really isn't. And as global statistical agencies rush toward 2030, embracing the efficiency of register-based tracking, it leaves you with a final, provocative idea to chew on. If nations transition entirely to AI-driven silent administrative registers instead of directly asking us who we are and where we live, do we lose our democratic right to define ourselves? Will we simply become whatever the algorithms and tax records say we are? Think about that the next time you find yourself wishing you didn't have a government form to fill out.